Chapter 6. Ursus as tutor and Ursus as guardian. Ursus added, "Some of these days I will play them a nasty trick. I will marry them." Ursus taught Gwynplaine the theory of love. He said to him, "Do you know how the Almighty lights the fire called love? He places the woman underneath, the devil between, and the man at the top. A match, that is to say a look, and behold, it is all on fire." "A look is unnecessary," answered Gwynplaine, thinking of Dea. And Ursus replied, "Booby, do souls require mortal eyes to see each other?" Ursus was a good fellow at times. Gwynplaine, sometimes madly in love with Dea, became melancholy, and made use of the presence of Ursus as a guard on himself. One day Ursus said to him, "Bah, do not put yourself out. When in love, the cock shows himself." "But the eagle conceals himself," replied Gwynplaine. At other times, Ursus would say to himself apart, "It is wise to put spokes in the wheels of the Cytherean car. They love each other too much. This may have its disadvantages. Let us avoid a fire. Let us moderate these hearts." Then Ursus had recourse to warnings of this nature, speaking to Gwynplaine when Dea slept, and to Dea when Gwynplaine's back was turned. "Dea, you must not be so fond of Gwynplaine. To live in the life of another is perilous. Egoism is a good root of happiness. Men escape from women, and then Gwynplaine might end by becoming infatuated with you. His success is so great. You have no idea how great his success is." "Gwynplaine, disproportions are no good. So much ugliness on one side and so much beauty on another ought to compel a reflection. Temper your ardor, my boy. Do not become too enthusiastic about Dea. Do you seriously consider that you were made for her? Just think of your deformity and her perfection. See the distance between her and yourself. She has everything, this Dea. What white skin, what hair, lips like strawberries, and her foot, her hand, those shoulders with their exquisite curve. Her expression is sublime. She walks diffusing light, and in speaking, the grave tone of her voice is charming. But for all this, to think that she is a woman. She would not be such a fool as to be an angel. She has absolute beauty. Repeat all this to yourself to calm your ardor." These speeches redoubled the love of Gwynplaine and Dea, and Ursus was astonished at his want of success, and just as one who should say, "It is singular that with all the oil I throw on fire I cannot extinguish it." Did he then desire to extinguish their love, or to cool it even? Certainly not. He would have been well punished had he succeeded. At the bottom of his heart, his love, which was a flame for them and warmth for him, was his delight. But it is natural to grate a little against that which charms us. Men call it wisdom. Ursus had been, in his relations with Gwynplaine and Dea, almost a father and a mother, grumbling all the while. He had brought them up, nourished them. His adoption of them had made the hut roll more heavily, and he had oftener been compelled to harness himself by Homo's side to help draw it. We may observe, however, that after the first few years, when Gwynplaine was nearly grown up, and Ursus had grown quite old, Gwynplaine had taken his turn and drawn Ursus. Ursus, seeing that Gwynplaine was becoming a man, had cast the horoscope of his deformity. "It has made your fortune," he had told him. This family of an old man and 2 children with a wolf had become, as they wandered, a group more and more intimately united. Their errant life had not hindered education. To wander is to grow, Ursus said. Gwynplaine was evidently made to exhibit at fairs. Ursus had cultivated him in feats of dexterity, and had encrusted him as much as possible with all he himself possessed of science and wisdom. Ursus, contemplating the perplexing mask of Gwynplaine's face, often growled, "He has begun well. It was for this reason he had perfected him with every ornament of philosophy and wisdom." He repeated constantly to Gwynplaine, "Be a philosopher. To be wise is to be invulnerable. You see what I am. I have never shed a tear. This is the result of my wisdom. Do you think that occasion for tears has been for wanting? Had I felt disposed to weep?" Ursus, in one of his monologues in the hearing of the wolf, said, "I have taught Gwynplaine everything, Latin included. I have taught Dea nothing, music included." He had taught them both to sing. He had himself a pretty talent for playing on the oaten reed, little flute of that period. He played on it agreeably, as also on the chiffony, a sort of beggar's hurdy-gurdy, mentioned in the Chronicle of Bertrand Duguesclin as the truant instrument which started the symphony. These instruments attracted the crowd. Ursus would show them the chiffony and say it is called the organistrum in Latin. He had taught Dea and Gwynplaine to sing according to the method of Orpheus and of Egaid Bengoa. Frequently he interrupted the lessons with cries of enthusiasm, such as Orpheus, musician of Greece, Benoit, musician of Picardy. These branches of careful culture did not occupy the children so much as prevent their adoring each other. They had mingled their hearts together as they grew up, as two saplings planted near mingle their branches as they become trees. "No matter," said Ursus, "I will marry them." Then he grumbled to himself, "They are quite tiresome with their love." The past, their little past at least, had no existence for Dea and Gwynplaine. They only knew what Ursus had told them of it. They called Ursus father. The only remembrance which Gwynplaine had of his infancy was of a passage of demons over his cradle. He had an impression of it all having been trodden in the darkness under deformed feet. Was this intentional or not? He was ignorant on this point. That which he remembered clearly, and to the slightest detail, were his tragical adventures when he had deserted at Portland. The finding of Dea made his dismal night a radiant state for him. The memory of Dea, even more than that of Gwynplaine, was lost in the clouds. In so young a child, all remembrance melts away. She recollected her mother as something cold. Had she even seen the sun? Perhaps so. She made efforts to pierce into the blank which was her past life. The sun. What was it? She had some vague memory of a thing, luminous and warm, of which Gwynplaine had taken the place. They spoke to each other in low tones. It is certain that cooing is the most important thing in the world. Dea often said to Gwynplaine, "Light means that you are speaking." Once, no longer containing himself, as he saw through a muslin sleeve the arm of Dea, Gwynplaine brushed its transparency with his lips. Ideal kiss of a deformed mouth. Dea felt a deep delight. She blushed like a rose. This kiss from a monster made Aurora gleam on that beautiful brow full of night. However, Gwynplaine sighed with a kind of terror, and the neckerchief of Dea gaped. He could not refrain from looking at the whiteness visible through the glimpse of paradise. Dea pulled up her sleeve, and stretching towards Gwynplaine her naked arm, said, "Again." Gwynplaine fled. The next day the game was renewed, with variations. It was a heavenly subsidence into that sweet abyss called love. At such things heaven smiles philosophically. Chapter 7. Blindness gives lessons in clairvoyance. At times Gwynplaine reproached himself. He made his happiness a case of conscience. He fancied that to allow a woman who could not see him to love him was to deceive her. What could she have said? Could she have suddenly obtained her sight? How she would have felt repulsed by what had previously attracted her. How she would have recoiled from that frightful lodestone. What a cry, what a covering of her face, what a flight! A bitter scruple harassed him. He told himself that such a monster as he had no right to love. He was a hydra idolized by a star. It was his duty to enlighten the blind star. One day he said to Dea, "You know that I am very ugly." "I know that you are sublime," she answered. He resumed, "When you hear all the world laugh, they laugh at me because I am horrible." "I love you," said Dea. After a silence, she added, "I was in death. You brought me to life. When you are here, my heaven is by my side. Give me your hand that I may touch heaven." Their hands met and grasped each other. They spoke no more, but were silent in the plenitude of love. Ursus, who was crabbed, had overheard this. The next day, when the three were together, he said, "For that matter, Dea is ugly also." The word produced no effect. Dea and Gwynplaine were not listening. Absorbed in each other, they rarely heeded such exclamations from Ursus. Their depth was a dead loss. This time, however, the precaution of Ursus, "Dea is also ugly," indicated in this learned man a certain knowledge of women. It is certain that Gwynplaine, in his loyalty, had been guilty of an imprudence. To have said, "I am ugly," to any other blind girl than Dea might have been dangerous. To be blind and in love is to be twofold blind. In such a situation, dreams are dreamt. Illusion is the food of dreams. Take illusion from love, and you take from it its ailment. It is compounded of every enthusiasm, both physical and moral admiration. Moreover, you should never tell a woman a word difficult to understand. She will dream about it, and she often dreams falsely. An enigma in a reverie spoils it. The shock caused by the fall of a careless word displaces that against which it strikes. At times it happens, without our knowing why, that because we have received the obscure blow of a chance word, the heart empties itself insensibly of love. He who loves perceives a decline in his happiness. Nothing is to be feared more than this slow exudation from the fissure in the vase. Happily, Dea was not formed of such clay. The stuff of which other women are made had not been used in her construction. She had a rare nature. The frame, but not the heart, was fragile. A divine perseverance in love was in the heart of her being. The whole disturbance which the word used by Gwynplaine had produced in her ended in her saying one day, "To be ugly, what is it? It is to do wrong. Gwynplaine only does good. He is handsome." Then, under the form of interrogation so familiar to children and to the blind, she resumed, "To see. What is it that you call seeing? For my own part, I cannot see. I know it seems to see means to hide." "What do you mean?" said Gwynplaine. Dea answered, "To see is a thing which conceals the true." "No," said Gwynplaine. "But yes," replied Dea, "since you say you are ugly." She reflected for a moment, then said, "Storyteller." Gwynplaine felt the joy of having confessed and of not being believed. Both his conscience and his love were consoled. Thus they had reached Dea 16, Gwynplaine nearly 25. They were not, as it would now be expressed, more advanced than the first day. Less even, for it may be remembered that on their wedding night she was 9 months and he 10 years old. A sort of holy childhood that had continued in their love. Thus it sometimes happens that a belated nightingale prolongs her nocturnal song till dawn. Their caresses went no further than pressing hands, or lips brushing a naked arm. Soft, half-articulate whispers sufficed them. 24 and 16. So it happened that Ursus, who did not lose sight of the ill he intended to do them, said, "One of these days you must choose a religion." "Wherefore?" inquired "That is already done," said Dea. Dea did not understand that they could be more than man and wife than they were already. At bottom, this chimerical and virginal content, this innocent union of souls, this celibacy taken for marriage, was not displeasing to Ursus. Besides, were they not already married? If the indissoluble existed anywhere, was it not in their union? Gwynplaine and Dea, they were creatures worthy of the love they mutually felt, flung by misfortune into each other's arms. And as if they were not enough in this first link, love had survened on misfortune, and had attached them united and bound together. What power could ever break that iron chain bound with knots of flowers? They were indeed bound together. Dea had beauty, Gwynplaine had sight. Each brought a dowry. They were more than coupled. They were paired, separated solely by their sacred interposition of innocence. Though dream as Gwynplaine would, however, and absorb all meaner passions, as he could in contemplation of Dea before the tribunal of conscience. He was a man. Fatal laws are not to be eluded. He underwent, like everything else in nature, the obscure fermentations willed by the Creator. At times, therefore, he looked at the women who were in the crowd, but he immediately felt that the look was a sin, and hastened to retire, repentant, into his own soul. Let us add that he met with no encouragement. On the face of every woman who looked upon him, he saw aversion, antipathy, repugnance, and rejection. It was clear that no other than Dea was possible for him. This aided his repentance. Chapter 8. Not only happiness, but prosperity. What true things are told in stories. The burned scar of the invisible fiend who has touched you is remorse for a wicked thought. In Gwynplaine, evil thoughts never ripened, and he had therefore no remorse. Sometimes he felt regret. Vague mists of conscience. What was this? Nothing. Their happiness was complete, so complete that they were no longer even poor. From 1680 to 1704, a great change had taken place. It happened sometimes, in the year 1704, that as night fell on some little village on the coast, a great heavy van drawn by a pair of stout horses made its entry. It was like the shell of a vessel reversed. The keel for a roof, the deck for a floor, placed on 4 wheels. The wheels were all the same size, and high as wagon wheels. Wheels, pole, and van were all painted green, with a rhythmical gradation of shades which ranged from bottle green for the wheels to apple green for the roofing. This green color had succeeded in drawing attention to the carriage, which was known in all the fairgrounds as the Green Box. The Green Box had but 2 windows, one at each extremity, and at the back a door with steps to let down. On the roof, from a tube painted green like the rest, smoke arose. This moving house was always varnished and washed afresh. In front of it, on a ledge fastened to the van, with a window for a door, behind the horses and by the side of an old man who held the reins and directed the team, 2 gypsy women, dressed as goddesses, sounded their trumpets. The astonishment with which the villagers regarded this machine was overwhelming. This was the old establishment of Ursus, its proportions augmented by success, and improved from a wretched booth to a theatre. A kind of animal between a dog and a wolf was chained under the van. This was Homo. The old coachman who drove the horses was the philosopher himself. Whence came this improvement from the miserable hut to the Olympic caravan? From this, Gwynplaine had become famous. It was with a correct scent of what would succeed amongst men that Ursus had said to Gwynplaine, "They made your fortune." Ursus, it may be remembered, had made Gwynplaine his pupil. Unknown people had worked upon his face. He, on the other hand, had worked on his mind, and behind this well-executed mask he had placed all he could of thought. So soon as the growth of the child had rendered him fitted for it, he had brought him out on the stage. That is, he had introduced him in front of the van. The effect of his appearance had been surprising. The passers-by were immediately struck with wonder. Never had anything been so seen as to be compared this extraordinary mimic of laughter. They were ignorant how the miracle of infectious hilarity had been obtained. Some believed it to be natural, others declared it to be artificial, and as conjecture was added to reality, everywhere, at every crossroad on the journey, in all the grounds of fairs and pits, the crowd ran after Gwynplaine. Thanks to this great attraction, there had come into the poor purse of the wandering group, first a rain of farthings, then of heavy pennies, then finally of shillings. The curiosity of one place exhausted, they passed on to another. Rolling does not enrich a stone, but it enriches a caravan, and year by year from city to city, with the increased growth of Gwynplaine's person and of his ugliness, the fortune predicted by Ursus had come. "What a good turn they did do there, my boy," said Ursus. This fortune had allowed Ursus, who was the administrator of Gwynplaine's success, to have the chariot of his dreams constructed, that is to say, a caravan large enough to carry a theatre, and to sow science and art in the highways. Moreover, Ursus had been able to add to the group composed of himself, Homo, Gwynplaine, and Dea, 2 horses and 2 women, who were the goddesses of the troop, and, as we have just said, and its servants. A mythological frontispiece was, in those days, of service to a caravan on mountebanks. "We are a wandering temple," said Ursus. These 2 gypsies, picked up by the philosopher from amongst the vagabondage of cities and suburbs, were ugly and young, and they were called by order of Ursus, the one Phoebe and the other Venus. For these read Phoebe and Venus, that we may conform to the English pronunciation. Phoebe cooked, Venus scrubbed the temple. Moreover, on days of performance they dressed Dea. Mountebanks have their public life as well as princes, and on these occasions Dea was arrayed, like Phoebe and Venus, in a Florentine petticoat of flowered stuff and a woman's jacket without sleeves, leaving the arms bare. Ursus and Gwynplaine wore men's jackets, and, like sailors on board a man of war, great loose trousers. Gwynplaine had besides, for his work and for his feats of strength, round his neck and over his shoulder, an esclavine of leather. He took charge of the horses. Ursus and Homo took charge of each other. Dea, being used to the green box, came and went in the interior of the wheeled house with almost as much ease and certainty as those who saw. The eye, which could penetrate within the structure and its internal arrangements, might have perceived in the corner fastened to the planks, and immovable on its 4 wheels, the old hut of Ursus, placed on a half-pay and allowed to rest, and from thenceforth dispensed the labor of rolling, as Ursus was relieved from the labor of drawing it. This hut, in a corner at the back, to the right of the door, served as bedchamber and dressing room to Ursus and Gwynplaine. It now contained 2 beds. In the opposite corner was the kitchen. The arrangement of the vessel was not more precise and concise than that of the interior of the green box. Everything within it was in its place, arranged, foreseen, and intended. The caravan was divided into 3 compartments, partitioned from each other. These communicated by open spaces without doors. A piece of stuff fell over them, and answered the purpose of concealment. The compartment behind belonged to the men, the compartment in front to the women. The compartment in the middle, separating the 2 sexes, was the stage. The instruments of the orchestra and the properties were kept in the kitchen. A loft under the arch of the roof contained the scenes, and on opening a trapdoor, lamps appeared, producing wonders of light. Ursus was the poet of these magical representations. He wrote the pieces. He had a diversity of talents. He was clever at sleight of hand. Besides the voices he imitated, he produced all sorts of unexpected things, shocks of light and darkness, spontaneous formations of figures or words, as he willed, on the partition vanishing figures, and chiaroscuro, strange things amidst which he seemed to meditate, unmindful of the crowd who marveled at him. One day Gwynplaine said to him, "Father, you look like a sorcerer." And Ursus replied, "Then I look perhaps like what I am." The green box was built on a clear model of Ursus's, contained this refinement of ingenuity, that between the fore and hind wheels, the central panel on the left side turned on hinges by the aid of chains and pulleys, and could be let down at will like a drawbridge. As it dropped, it set at liberty 3 legs on hinges, which supported the panel when let down, and which placed themselves straight on the ground like the legs of a table, and supported it above the earth like a platform. This exposed the stage, which was thus enlarged by the platform in front. This opening looked for all the world like the mouth of hell. In the words of the itinerant Puritan preachers, you turned away from it with horror. It was perhaps for some such pious invention that Solon kicked out Thespis, for all that Thespis had lasted much longer than is generally believed. The traveling theatre is still in existence. It was on those stages on wheels that, in the 16th and 17th centuries, they performed in England the ballets and dances of Amner and Pilkington, in France the pastorals of Gilbert Collin, and in Flanders at the annual fairs the double choruses of Clement called Non Papa, in Germany the Adam and Eve of Thales, and in Italy the Venetian exhibitions of Animusia and of Cafosse, with the Sylvae of Casaldo, the Prince of Venosa, the Satyr of Laura Guidiccioni, the Despair of Philene, the Death of Ocolino, by Vincent Galileo, father of the astronomer, which Vincent Galileo sang his own music and accompanied himself on his viol da gamba, as well as the first attempts of the Italian opera from 1580, substituted free inspiration for the madrigal style. The chariot of the color of hope, which carried Ursus, Gwynplaine, and their fortunes, and in the front of which Phoebe and Vinal, trumpeted like figures of fame, played its part of this grand bohemian and literary brotherhood. Thespis would no more have disowned Ursus than Concrio would have disowned Gwynplaine. Arrived at open spaces in towns and villages, Ursus, in the intervals between the tutoing of Phoebe and Vinos, gave instructive revelations as to the trumpetings. "This symphony is Gregorian," he would exclaim. "Citizens and townsmen of the Gregorian form of worship. This great progress is opposed in Italy as to the ambrosial ritual, and in Spain to the Mozarabic ceremonial, and has achieved its triumph over them with difficulty." After which, the green box drew up in some place chosen by Ursus, an evening having fallen, and the panel stage having been let down, the theatre opened, and the performance began. The scene of the green box represented a landscape painted by Ursus, and as he did not know how to paint, it represented a caravan just as well as a landscape. The curtain, which we call a drop nowadays, was a checked silk, with squares of contrasted colors. The public stood without in the street in the fair, forming a semicircle around the stage, exposed to the sun and the showers, an arrangement which made the rain less desirable for theatres in these days than now. When they could, they acted in an inn-yard, on which occasions the windows of the different stories made rows of boxes for the spectators. The theatre was thus more enclosed, and the audience a more paying one. Ursus was in everything, in the piece, in the company, in the kitchen, in the orchestra. Minos beat the drum and handled the sticks with great dexterity. Phoebe played on the marachi, a kind of guitar. The wolf had been promoted to be a utility gentleman, and played, as occasion required, his little parts. Often, when they appeared side by side on stage, Ursus in his tightly laced bear's skin, Homo in his wolf's skin, fitting still better. could tell which was the beast. This flattered Ursus. Chapter 9. Absurdities which folks without taste call poetry. The pieces written by Ursus were interludes, a kind of composition out of fashion nowadays. One of these pieces, which has not come down to us, was entitled Ursus Versus. It is probable that he played the principal part himself. Pretended exit, followed by a reappearance, was apparently its praiseworthy and sober subject. The titles of the interludes of Ursus were sometimes Latin, as we have seen, and the poetry frequently Spanish. The Spanish verses written by Ursus were rhymed, as was nearly all Castilian poetry of that period. This did not puzzle the people. Spanish was then a familiar language, and the English sailors spoke Castilian, even as the Roman sailors spoke Carthaginian. See Plautus. Moreover, at a theatrical representation, as at a mass, Latin, or any other language unknown to the audience, is by no means a subject of care within them. They get out of the dilemma by adapting to the sounds of familiar words. Our old Gaelic France was particularly prone to this manner of being devout at church under the cover of an immolatus. The faithful chanted, "I will make merry," and under a sanctus, "Kiss me, sweet." The Council of Trent was required to put an end to these familiarities. Ursus had composed expressly for Gwynplaine an interlude, with which he was well pleased. It was his best work. He had thrown his whole soul into it. To give the sum of all one's talents in the production is the greatest triumph that anyone can achieve. The toad which produces a toad achieves a grand success. You doubt it? Try, then, to do as much. Ursus had carefully polished this interlude. His bear's cub was entitled Chaos Vanquished. Here it was, a night scene. When the curtain drew up, the crowd, massed around the green box, saw nothing but blackness. In this blackness, three confused forms moved in the reptile state. Wolf, a bear, and a man. The wolf acted as the wolf, Ursus the bear, Gwynplaine the man. The wolf and the bear represented ferocious forces of nature, unreasoning hunger and savage ignorance. Both rushed on Gwynplaine. It was chaos combating man. No face could be distinguished. Gwynplaine fought enfolded in a winding sheet, and his face covered by his thickly falling locks. All else was shadow. The bear growled. The wolf gnashed his teeth. The man cried out. The man was down. The beasts overwhelmed him. He cried for aid and succor. He hurled into the unknown an agonized appeal. He gave a death rattle. To witness this agony of the prostate of man, now scarcely distinguishable from the brutes, was appalling. The crowd looked on breathless. In 1 minute more, the wild beasts would triumph, and chaos reabsorb the man. A struggle, cries, howling. Then, all at once, silence. A song in the shadows. A breath had passed, and they heard a voice. Mysterious music floated, accompanying this chant of the invisible, and suddenly, none knowing whence or how, a white apparition rose. This apparition was a light. This light was a woman. This woman was a spirit. Dea, calm, fair, beautiful, formidable, in her serenity and sweetness, appeared in the center of a luminous mist, a profile of brightness in dawn. She was a voice light, deep, indescribable. She sang in the newborn light. She, invisible, made visible. They thought that they heard the hymn of an angel or the song of a bird. At this apparition, the man, starting up in his ecstasy, struck the beast with his fists and overthrew them. Then the vision, gliding along in a manner difficult to understand, and therefore the more admired, sang these words in Spanish, sufficiently pure for the English sailors who were present. Or ces raisons, de leurs elles sont. Then, looking down as if she saw a gulf beneath, she went on, Noche grita de Ali, el alba canta el Ali. As she sang, the man raised himself by degrees. Instead of lying, he was now kneeling, his hands elevated towards the vision, his knees resting on the beast, which lay motionless as if thunder-stricken. She continued, turning towards him. Es menester es cielo y tú que iloribus ria, and approaching him with the majesty of a star, she added, Jebra person deja monstero, a tu negro caparazon, and she put a hot hand on his brow. Then another voice arose, deeper and consequently still sweeter, a voice broken and enwrapped with a gravity both tender and wild. It was the human chant responding to the chant of the stars. Gwynplaine, still in obscurity, his head under Dea's hand, and kneeling on the vanquished bear and wolf, sang, O ven ama, hare alma, soy corazon. And suddenly, from the shadow, a ray of light fell full upon Gwynplaine, and through the darkness was the monster full exposed. To describe the commotion of the crowd is impossible. A sun of laughter rising, such was the effect. Laughter springs from the unexpected causes, and nothing could be more unexpected than this termination. Never was sensation comparable to that produced by the ray of light striking on that mask, at once ludicrous and terrible. They laughed all around his laugh, everywhere, above, below, behind, before, at the uttermost distance. Men, women, old grey-heads, rosy-faced children, the good, the wicked, the gay, the sad, everybody, even in the streets, the passers-by who could see nothing, hearing the laughter, laughed also. The laughter ended in clapping of hands and stamping of feet. The curtain dropped. Gwynplaine was recalled within the frenzy. Hence an immense success. Have you seen chaos vanquished? Gwynplaine was run after. The listless came to laugh. The melancholy came to laugh. Evil consciences came to laugh, a laugh so irresistible that it seemed almost an epidemic. But there is a pestilence from which men do not fly, and that is the contagion of joy. The success, it must be admitted, did not rise higher than the populace. A great crowd means a crowd of nobodies. Chaos vanquished could be seen for a penny. Fashionable people never go anywhere the price of admission is a penny. Ursus thought a good deal of his work, which he had brooded over for a long time. It is in the style of one Shakespeare, he said modestly. The juxtaposition of Dea added to the indescribable effect produced by Gwynplaine, her white face seen, by the side of the gnome represented, what might have been called divine astonishment. The audiences regarded Dea with a sort of mysterious anxiety. They had in her aspect the dignity of a virgin and of a priestess, not knowing man and knowing God. They saw that she was blind, and felt that she could see. She seemed to stand on the threshold of the supernatural. The light that beamed on her seemed half earthly and half heavenly. They had come to work on earth, and to work as heaven works in the radiance of morning. Finding a hydra, she formed a soul. She seemed like a creative power, satisfied but astonished at the result of her creation, and the audience fancied that she could see in the divine surprise of that face, desire of the cause, and wonder at the result. They felt that she loved this monster. Did she know that he was one? Yes, since she touched him. No, since she accepted him, this depth of night and this glory of day, united, formed in the mind of the spectator, a chiaroscuro, in which appeared endless perspectives. How much divinity exists in the germ, in what manner the penetration of the soul into matter is accomplished, how the solar ray, the deformed, becomes These glimpses of mysteries added an almost cosmical emotion to the convulsive hilarity produced by Gwynplaine, without going too deep, for spectators do not like the fatigue of seeking below the surface. Something more was understood than was perceived, and this strange spectacle had the transparency of an avatar. As to Dea, what she felt cannot be expressed by human words. She knew that she was in the midst of a crowd, and knew not what a crowd was. She heard a murmur. That was all. For her the crowd was but a breath. Generations are passing breaths. Man respires, aspires, and expires. In that crowd, Dea felt herself alone and shuddering as one hanging over a precipice. Suddenly, in this trouble of innocence, in distress prompt to accuse the unknown, in her dread, a possible fall, Dea, serene notwithstanding, and superior to the vague agonies of peril, but inwardly shuddering at her isolation, found confidence and support. She had seized her thread of safety in the universe of shadows. She put her hand on the powerful head of Gwynplaine. Joy unspeakable. She placed her rosy fingers in his forest crisp of hair. Wool, when touched, gives an impression of softness. Dea touched a lamb which she knew to be a lion. Her whole heart poured out an ineffable love. She felt out of danger. She had found her savior, the public beloved, that they saw contrary. To the spectators, the being loved was Gwynplaine, and the savior was Dea. What matters, thought Ursus, to whom the heart of Dea was visible, and Dea, reassured, consoled, and delighted, adored the angel, whilst the people contemplated the monster and endured, fascinated herself as well, though in the opposite sense, that dread Promethean laugh. True love is never weary, being all soul it cannot cool. A brazier comes to be full of cinders, not so a star. Her exquisite impressions were renewed every evening for Dea, and she was ready to weep with tenderness, whilst the audience was in convulsions of laughter. Those around her were joyful. She was happy. The sensation of gaiety due to the sudden shock caused by the rictus of Gwynplaine was evidently not intended by Ursus. He would have preferred more smiles and less laughter, and more a literary triumph. But success consoles. He reconciled himself every evening to his excessive triumphs, as he counted how many shillings the pile of farthings made, and how many pounds the piles of shillings, and besides, he said, after all, when the laugh had passed, chaos vanquished would be found in the depths of their minds, and something of it would remain there. Perhaps he was not altogether wrong. The foundations of work settled down in the mind of the public. The truth is that the populace, attentive to the wolf, the bear, and to the man, then to the music, to the howlings governed by harmony, to the night dissipated by dawn, to the chant releasing the light, accepted with a confused, dull sympathy, and with a certain emotional respect, the dramatic poem of chaos vanquished, the victory of spirit over matter, ending with the joy of man. Such were the vulgar pleasures of the people. They sufficed them. The people had not means of going to the noble matches of the gentry, and could not, like lords and gentlemen, bet 1,000 guineas on Helmscale against Phelim Guillemedon. Chapter 10. An outsider's view of men and things. Man has a notion of revenging himself on that which pleases him, hence the contempt felt for the comedian. This being charms me, diverts, distracts, teaches, enchants, consoles me, flings me into an ideal world, is agreeable and useful to me. What evil can I do him in return? Humiliate him. Disdain is a blow from afar. Let us strike the blow. He pleases me, therefore he is vile. He serves me, therefore I hate him. Where can I find a stone to throw at him? Priest, give me yours. Philosopher, give me yours. excommunicate him. Rousseau, insult him. Orator, spit the pebbles from your mouth at him. Bear, fling your stones. Let us cast stones at the tree, hit the fruit, and eat it. Bravo, and down with him. To repeat poetry is to be infected with the plague. Wretched play actor, we will put him in the pillory for his success. Let him follow up his triumph with our hisses. Let him collect a crowd and create a solitude. Thus it is that the wealthy, termed the higher classes, have invented for the actor that form of isolation. Applause. The crowd is less brutal. They neither hated nor despised Gwynplaine. Only the meanest caulker of the meanest crew of the meanest merchantman, anchored in the meanest English seaport, considered himself immeasurably superior to this amuser of the scum, and believed that a caulker is as superior to an actor as a lord is to a caulker. Gwynplaine was, therefore, like all comedians, applauded and kept at a distance. Truly, all success in this world is a crime, and must be expiated. He who obtains the medal has to take its reverse side as well. For Gwynplaine there was no reverse. In this sense, both sides of his medal pleased him. He was satisfied with the applause, and content with the isolation. In applause he was rich, in isolation happy. To be rich in his low estate means to be no longer wretchedly poor, to have neither holes in his clothes, nor cold in his earth, nor emptiness in his stomach. It is to eat when hungry and drink when thirsty. It is to have everything necessary, including a penny for a beggar. This indigent wealth, enough for liberty, was possessed by Gwynplaine. So far as his soul was concerned, he was opulent. He had love. What more could he want? Nothing. You may think that had the offer been made to him to remove his deformity, he would have grasped at it. Yet he would have refused it emphatically. What? To throw off his mask and have his former face restored, to be the creature he had perchance been created, handsome and charming? No, he would never have consented to it. For what would he have to support Dea? What would become of the poor child, the sweet, blind girl who loved him? Without his rictus, which made him a clown without parallel, he would have been a mountebank, like any other, a common athlete, a picker-up of a pence from the chinks in the pavement, and Dea would perhaps not have had bread every day. It was with deep and tender pride that he felt himself the protector of the helpless and heavenly creature. Night, solitude, nakedness, weakness, ignorance, hunger, and thirst, 7 yawning jaws of misery were raised around her, and he was the St. George, fighting the dragon. He triumphed over poverty. How? By his deformity. By his deformity he was useful, helpful, victorious, great. He had but to show himself, and money poured in. He was a master of crowds, the sovereign of the mob. He could do everything for Dea. Her wants he foresaw, her desires, her tastes, her fancies, in the limited sphere in which wishes are possible to the blind. He fulfilled. Gwynplaine and Dea were, as we have already shown, providence to each other. He felt himself raised on her wings. She felt herself carried in his arms. To protect the being who loves you, to give what she requires to her who shines on you as your star, can anything be sweeter? Gwynplaine possessed this supreme happiness, and he owed it to his deformity. His deformity had raised him above all. By it he had gained the means of life for himself and others. By it he had gained independence, liberty, celebrity, internal satisfaction, and pride. In his deformity he was inaccessible. The fates could do nothing beyond this blow in which they had spent their whole life force, and which he had turned into a triumph. This lowest depth of misfortune had become the summit of Elysium. Gwynplaine was imprisoned in his deformity, but with Dea, and This was, as we have already said, to live in a dungeon of paradise. A wall stood between them and the living world, so much the better. This wall protected as well as enclosed them. What could affect Dea? What could affect Gwynplaine with such a fortress around them? To take from him the success was impossible. They would have had to deprive him of his face, take from him his love. Impossible. Dea could not see him. The blindness of Dea was divinely incurable. What harm did his deformity do Gwynplaine? None. What advantage did it give him? Every advantage. He was beloved, notwithstanding its horror, and perhaps for that very cause. Infirmity and deformity had by instinct been drawn towards and coupled with each other. To be beloved, is that not everything? Gwynplaine thought of his disfigurement only with gratitude. He was blessed in that stigma. With joy he felt that it was irredeemable and eternal. What a blessing that it was so. While there were highways and fairgrounds and journeys to take, the people below and the sky above, they would be sure to live. Dea would want nothing, and they should have love. Gwynplaine would not have changed faces with Apollo. To be a monster was his form of happiness. Thus, as we have said before, destiny had given him all, even to overflowing. He who had been rejected had been preferred. He was so happy that he felt compassion for the men around him. He pitied the rest of the world. Thus, as we had said before, destiny had given him all, even to overflowing. He who had been rejected had been preferred. He was so happy that he felt compassion for the men around him. He pitied the rest of the world. It was, besides, his instinct to look about him, because no one is always consistent, and a man's nature is not always theoretic. He was delighted to live within an enclosure, but from time to time he lifted his head just above the wall. Then he retreated again with more joy into his loneliness with Dea. Having drawn his comparisons, what did he see around him? What were those living creatures of which his wandering life showed him so many specimens, changed every day? Always new crowds, always the same multitude, ever new faces, ever the same miseries, a jumble of ruins. Every evening, every phase of social misfortune came and encircled his happiness. The green box was popular. Low prices attract the low classes. Those who came were the weak, the poor, the little. They rushed to Gwynplaine as they rushed to gin. They came to buy a pennyworth of forgetfulness. From the height of his platform, Gwynplaine passed those wretched people in review. His spirit was enwrapped in the contemplation of every succeeding apparition of widespread misery. The physiognomy of man is modeled by conscience and by the tenor of life, and is the result of a crowd of mysterious excavations. There was never a suffering, not an anger, not a shame, not a despair, of which Gwynplaine did not see a wrinkle. The mouths of those children had not eaten. That man was father, but that woman a mother, and behind them their families might be guessed to be on the road to ruin. There was a face already marked by vice on the threshold of crime, and the reasons were plain: ignorance and indigence. Another showed the stamp of original goodness, obliterated by social pressure and turned to hate. On the face of an old woman he saw starvation, on that a girl, prostitution, the same fact, and although the girl had the resource of her youth, all the sadder for that. In the crowd were arms without tools. The workers asked only for work, but the work was wanting. Sometimes a soldier came and seated himself by the workmen, sometimes a wounded pensioner, and Gwynplaine saw the spectre of war. Here Gwynplaine read want of work. There man-farming, slavery. On certain brows he saw an indescribable ebbing back towards animalism, and that slow return imposed on those below by the dull pressure of happiness of those above. There was a break in the gloom for Gwynplaine. He had Dea, a loophole of happiness. The rest was damnation. Gwynplaine felt above him the thoughtless trampling of the powerful, the rich, the magnificent, the great, the elect of chance. Below he saw the pale faces of the disinherited. He saw himself and Dea, with their little happiness so great to themselves between two worlds. That which was above went and came free, joyous dancing, trampling underfoot. Above him the world which treads, below the world which is trodden upon. It is a fatal fact, and one indicating a profound social evil, that light should crush the shadow. Gwynplaine thoroughly grasped this dark evil. What, a destiny so reptile, shall a man drag himself thus along with such adherence to dust and corruption, with such vicious tastes, such an abdication of right, or such abjectness that one feels inclined to crush him underfoot? Of what butterfly is then this earthly life in the grub? What in the crowd which hungers and which denies everywhere, and before all, the questions of crime and of shame, the inflexibility of the law, producing laxity of conscience? There is no child that grows but to be stunted, no virgin but matures for sin, no rose that blooms but for the slime of the snail. His eyes at times sought everywhere with the curiosity of emotion to probe the depths of that darkness in which there died away so many useless efforts, and in which there struggled so much weariness, families devoured by society, morals tortured by laws, wounds gangrened by penalties, poverty gnawed by taxes, wrecked intelligence swallowed up by ignorance, rafts in distress alive with the famished, feuds, death rattles, cries, disappearances. He felt the vague oppression of a keen, universal suffering. He saw the vision of the foaming wave of misery dashing over the crowd of humanity. He was safe in port himself as he watched the wreck around him. Sometimes he laid his disfigured head in his hands and dreamed. What folly to be happy! How one dreams! Ideas were born within him, absurd notions crossed his brain. Because formerly he had succored as an infant, he felt a ridiculous desire to succor the whole world. The mists of reverie sometimes obscured his individuality, and he lost his ideas of proportion so far as to ask himself the question, what can be done for the poor? Sometimes he was so absorbed in his subject as to express it aloud. Then Ursus shrugged his shoulders and looked at him fixedly. Gwynplaine continued his reverie. Oh, were I powerful, would I not aid the wretched? But what am I? An atom. What can I do? Nothing. He was mistaken. He was able to do a great deal for the wretched. He could make them laugh, and as we have said, to make people laugh is to make them forget. What a benefactor on earth is he who can bestow forgetfulness. Chapter 11. Gwynplaine thinks justice, and Ursus talks truth. A philosopher is a spy. Ursus, a watcher of dreams, studied his pupil. Our monologues leave on our brows a faint reflection, distinguishable to the eye of physiognomist. Hence, what occurred to Gwynplaine did not escape Ursus. One day, as Gwynplaine was meditating, Ursus pulled him by his jacket and exclaimed, "You strike me as being an observer. You fool! Take care, it is no business of yours. You have one thing to do, to love Dea. You have two causes of happiness. The first is that the crowd sees your muzzle. The second is that Dea does not. You have no right to the happiness you possess, for no woman who saw your mouth would consent to your kiss. And that mouth which has made your fortune, and that face which has been given your riches, are not your own. You were not born with that countenance. It was borrowed from the grimace which set the bottom of the infinite. You have stolen your master's not seek to leave the cave and guard your star, O spider. You have in your web the carbuncle Venus. Do me the favor and be satisfied. I see your dreams are troubled. It is idiotic of you. Listen, I am going to speak to you in the language of true poetry. Let Dea eat beefsteaks and mutton chops, and in 6 months she will be as strong as a Turk. Marry her immediately. Give her a child, 2 children, 3 children, a long string of children. That is what I call philosophy. Moreover, it is happiness, which is no folly. To have children is a glimpse of heaven. Have brats, wipe them, blow their noses, dirt them, wash them, put them into bed. Let them swarm about you. If they laugh, it is well. If they howl, it is better. To cry is to live. Watch them suck at 6 months, crawl at a year, walk at 2, grow tall at 15, fall in love at 20. He who has these joys is everything. For myself, I lack the advantage, and that is the reason why I am a brute. God, a composer of beautiful poems, and the first of men of letters, said to his fellow workmen, Moses, increase and multiply. Such is the text. Multiply, you beast, as the world, it is as it is. You cannot make nor mar it. Do not trouble yourself about it. Pay no attention to what goes on outside. Leave the horizon alone. A comedian is to be looked at, not to look. Do you know what there is outside? The happy by right. You, I repeat, are the happy by chance. You are the pickpocket of happiness, of which there are proprietors. They are their legitimate possessors. You are the intruder. You live in the concubinage with luck. What do you want that you have not already? Shibboleth, help me. This fellow is a rascal. To multiply himself by Dea would be pleasant all the same. Such happiness is like a swindle. Those above who possess happiness by privilege do not like folks below them who have such enjoyment. If they ask you what is right, you have to be happy. You will not know what to answer. You have no patent, and they have. Jupiter, Allah, Vishnu, Sabaoth. It does not matter who has given them the passport to happiness. Fear them. Do not meddle with them, lest they should meddle with you. Wretch, do you know what the man is who is happy by right? He is a terrible being. He is a lord. He must have intrigued pretty well in the devil's unknown country before he was born, to enter life by the door he did. How difficult it must have been to him to be born. It's the only trouble he has given himself. But just heavens, what a one, to obtain from destiny the blind blockhead to mark him, in his cradle a master of men, to bribe the box-keeper, to give him the best place at the show. Read the memoranda in the old hut which I have placed on half-pay. Read the breviary of my wisdom, and you will see what it is to be a lord. A lord is one who has all and is all. A lord is one who exists above his own nature. A lord is one who has, when young, the rights of an old man, when old, the success in intrigue of a young one, if vicious, the homage of respectable people, if a coward, the command of brave men, if a do-nothing, the fruits of labor, if ignorant, the diploma of Cambridge or Oxford, if a fool, the admiration of the poets, if ugly, the smiles of women, if a Thersites, the helm of Achilles, if a hare, the skin of a lion. Do not misunderstand my words. I do not say that the Lord must necessarily be ignorant, a coward, ugly, stupid, or old. I only mean that he may be all of those things without detriment to himself. On the contrary, lords are princes. The King of England is only a lord, the first peer of the peerage, that is all. But it is much. Kings were formerly called lords. The Lord of Denmark, the Lord of Ireland, the Lord of the Isles, the Lord of Norway was first called king 300 years ago. Lucius, the most ancient king in England, was spoken to by Saint invoking the commons, addressed formerly as ad concilium impendendum, now addressed as ad consententium. To say yes is their liberty. The peers can say no, and the proof is that they have said it. The peers can cut off the king's head, the people cannot. The stroke of the hatchet which decapitated Charles I is an encroachment not on the king, but on the peers, and it is well to place on the gibbet the carcass of Cromwell. The lords have power. Why? Because they have riches. Who has turned over the leaves of the Doomsday Book? What is the proof that the lords possess England? It is the registry of the estates of subjects, compiled under William the Conqueror, and it is in the charge of the Chancellor of Exchequer. To copy anything in it, you have to pay 2 pence a line. It is a proud book. Do you know that I was a domestic doctor to a lord who was called Marmaduke, and who had 36,000 a year? To think of that, you hideous idiot. Do you know that with rabbits only from the warrens of Earl Lindsay, they could feel all the riff-raff of the Cinque Ports, and they good order kept. Every poacher is hung. For 2 long furry ears sticking out of the game bag, I saw the father of 6 children hanging on the gibbet. Such is the peerage. The rabbit of a great lord is of more importance than God's image in a man. Lords exist. You trespasser, do you see? And we must think that it is good that they do, and even if we do not, what harm will it do them? The people object indeed. Why, Plautus himself would never have attained the comicality of such an idea. A philosopher would be jesting if he advised the poor devil of the masses to cry out against the size and weight of the lords. Just as well, the knot might dispute the foot of an elephant. One day I saw a hippopotamus tread upon a molehill. He crushed it utterly. He was innocent. The great soft-headed fool of a mastodon did not know of the existence of moles. My son, the moles that are trodden on are the human race. To crush is a law. And do you think that the mole himself crushes nothing? Why, it is the mastodon of the fleshworm. Who is the mastodon of the glowworm? But let us cease arguing. My boy, there are coaches in the world. My lord is inside. The people under the wheels. The philosopher gets out of the way. Stand aside and let them pass. As to myself, I love lords, and I shun them. I lived with one. The beauty of my recollection suffices me. I remember his country house, like glory in a cloud. My dreams are all retrospective. Nothing could be more admirable than Marmaduke Lodge in grandeur. Beautiful symmetry, rich avenues, and the ornaments surrounding of the edifice. The houses, country seats, and palaces of the lords present, a selection of all that is the greatest and most magnificent in this flourishing kingdom. I love our lords. I thank them for being opulent, powerful, and prosperous. I myself am clothed in shadow, and I look with interest upon the red of heavenly blue, which is called a lord. You enter Marmaduke Lodge by an exceedingly spacious courtyard, which forms an oblong square, divided into 8 spaces, each surrounded by a balustrade. On each side is a wide approach, and a superb hexagonal fountain plays in the midst. This fountain is formed of 2 basins, which are surmounted by a dome of exquisite openwork, elevated on 6 columns. It was there that I knew a learned Frenchman, Monsieur l'Abbe de Croix, who belonged to the Jacobin monastery in the Rue Saint-Jacques. Half the library of Urpenius is at Marmaduke Lodge, the other half being at the Theological Gallery at Cambridge. I used to read the books seated under the ornamented portal. These things kingdoms are only shown to a select number of curious travelers. Do you know, you ridiculous boy, that William North, who is Lord Grave, Rolleston, and sits 14th on the bench of the barons, has more forest trees on his mountains than you have hares on your horrible noddle? Do you know that Lord Norreys of Rycote, who is Earl of Abingdon, has a square keep 100 feet high, having this device, Virtus Ariet Fotiol, which you would think meant that virtue is stronger than a ram, but it really means, you idiot, that courage is stronger. Nope. That courage is stronger than a battering machine. Yes, I honor, accept, respect, and revere our lords. It is the lords who, with their royal majesty, work to procure and preserve the advantages of the nation. Their consummate wisdom shines in intricate junctures. Their precedence over others I wish they had not, but they have it. What is called principality in German, grandeeship in Spain, is called peerage in England and France. There being a fair show of reason for considering the world a wretched place enough, heaven felt where the burden was most galling, and to prove that it knew how to make happy people, created lords for the satisfaction of philosophers. This acts as a set-off, and gets heaven out of the scrape, affording it a decent escape from a false position. The great are great. A peer, speaking to himself, says we. A peer is plural. The king qualifies the peer. Consanguinii nostri. The peers have made a multitude of wise laws, amongst others one which condemns to death anyone who cuts down a 3-year-old poplar tree. Their supremacy is such that they have a language of their own, in heraldic style. Black, which is called sable for gentry, is called Saturn for princes, and diamond for peers. Diamond dust, a night thick with stars, is the night of the happy. Even amongst themselves, those high and mighty lords have their own distinctions. A baron cannot wash with a viscount without his permission. These are excellent, indeed excellent things, and safeguards the nation. What a fine thing it is for the people to have 25 dukes, 5 marquis, 76 earls, 9 viscounts, and 61 barons, making altogether 176 peers, of which some are your grace, and some my lord. What matter a few rags here and there withal? Everybody cannot be dressed in gold. Let the rags be. Cannot you see the purple? One balances the other. A thing must be built of something. Yes, of course there are the poor. What of them? They line the happiness of the wealthy. Devil take it. Our lords are the glory. A pack of hounds belonging to Charles Baron Mohun costs him as much as the hospital for lepers in Moorgate, and for Christ's Hospital founded for children in 1553 by Edward VI. Thomas Osborne, Duke of Leeds, spends yearly on his liveries 5,000 golden guineas. The Spanish grandees have a guardian appointed by law to prevent their ruining themselves. That is cowardly. Our lords are extravagant and magnificent. I esteem them for it. Let us not abuse them like envious folks. I feel happy when a beautiful vision passes. I have not the light, but I have the reflection. A reflection thrown on my ulcer, you will say. But go to the devil. I am a Job delighted in the contemplation of the Charmalthian. Oh, that beautiful and radiant planet up there. But the moonlight is something. To suppress the lords was an idea which Orestes, mad as he was, would not have dared to entertain. To say that the lords are mischievous or useless is as much as to say the state should be revolutionized, and that the men are not made to live like cattle, browsing the grass and bitten by the dog. is all one to me. I am a philosopher, and I care as much about life as a fly. Life is but a lodging, and when I think that Henry Bowes Howard, Earl of Berkshire, has in his stable 24 state carriages, of which one is mounted in silver and another in gold, good heavens! I know that everyone has not got 24 state carriages, but there is no need to complain for all that. Because you were cold one night, what was that to him? It concerns you only. Others beside you suffer in cold and hunger. Don't you know that without the cold, Dea would not have been blind, and if Dea were not blind, she would not love you? Think of that, you fool. And besides, if all the people who were lost were to complain, there would be a petty tumult. Silence is the rule. I have no doubt that heaven imposes silence on the damned. Otherwise, heaven itself would be punished by their everlasting cry. The happiness of Olympus is brought by the silence of Coxtus. Then people be silent. I do better myself. I approve and admire. Just now I was enumerating the lords, and I ought to add to the list 2 archbishops and 24 bishops. Truly, I am affected when I think of it. I remember to have seen at the tithe gathering of the Reverend Dean of Refo, who combined the peerage with the church, a great tithe of beautiful wheat taken from the peasants in the neighborhood, of which the dean had not been at the trouble of growing. This left him time to say his prayers. Do you know that Lord Marmaduke, my master, was Lord Grand Treasurer of Ireland, and High Seneschal of the Sovereignty of Knaresborough, in the county of York? Do you know that the Lord High Chamberlain, which is an office hereditary in the family of the Dukes of Ancaster, dresses for the king for his coronation, and receives for his trouble 40 yards of crimson velvet, besides the bed on which the king has slept, and that the usher of the Black Rod, his deputy? I should like to see you deny this, that the superior Viscount of England is Robert Brent, created a Viscount by Henry V. The Lord's titles imply sovereignty over land, except that of Earl Rivers, who takes his title from his family name. How admirable is the right which to have tax over others, and to levy, for instance, 4 shillings in the pound sterling income tax, which has been continued for another year, and all the time taxes on distilled spirits, on the excise of wine, and on beer, on tonnage, and on poundage, on cider, and on perry, on malt, and prepared barley, on coals, and on 100 things besides. Let us venerate things as they are. The clergy themselves depend on the lords. The Bishop of Man is the subject to the Earl of Derby. The lords have wild beasts of their own, which they place in their armorial bearings. God not having made enough, they have invented others. They have created the heraldic wild boar, who is as much above the wild boar as the wild boar is above the domestic pig, and the Lord is above the priest. They have created the griffin, which is an eagle to lions and a lion to eagles, terrifying lions by his wings and eagles by his mane. They have the guivre, the unicorn, the serpent, the salamander, the tarasque, the tree, the dragon, and the hippogriff. All these things terrible to us are to them but an ornament and an embellishment. They have a menagerie, which they call the blazon, in which unknown beasts roar. The prodigies of the forest are nothing compared to the inventions of their pride. Their vanity is full of phantoms, which move as a sublime knight, armed with helm and cuirass, spurs on their heels, and scepters in their hands, saying in a grave voice, "We are the ancestors." The cankerworms eat the roots, and the panoplies eat the people. Why not? Are we to change the laws? The peerage is part of the order of society. Do you know that there is a duke in Scotland who can ride 90 miles without leaving his own estate? Do you know that the Archbishop of Canterbury £700,000 a year. Do you know that Her Majesty has £700,000 sterling from the civil list, and besides forests, domains, fiefs, tenancies, freeholds, prebendaries, tithes, rent, confiscations, and fines, which brings in over £1 million sterling. Those who are not satisfied are hard to please. Yes, murmured Gwynplaine sadly. The paradise of the rich is made out of the hell of the poor. Chapter 12. Ursus the poet drags on. Ursus the philosopher. Then Dea entered. He looked at her and saw nothing but her. This is love. One may be carried away for a moment by the importunity of some other idea, but the beloved one enters, and all that does not appertain to her presence immediately fades away, without her dreaming that perhaps she is facing in us a world. Let us mention a circumstance. In Chaos Vanquished, the word monstruo addresses Gwynplaine, displeased Dea. Sometimes, with the smattering of Spanish which everyone knew at the period, she took it into her head to replace it by quiero, which signifies I wish it. Ursus tolerated, although not without an expression of impatience, this alteration to his text. He might have said to Dea, as in our day, Mozart said to Vissot, "Tu manques de respect au repertoire." The Laughing Man. Such was the form of Gwynplaine's fame. His name, Gwynplaine, little known at any time, had disappeared under his nickname, as his face had disappeared under its grin. His popularity was like his visage, a mask. His name, however, was to be read on a large placard in front of the green box which offered the crowd the following narrative composed by Ursus. Here is to be seen Gwynplaine, deserted at the age of 10 on the night of the 29th of January 1690, by the villainous Comporchicos on the coast of Portland. The little boy has grown up, and is called now the Laughing Man. The existence of these mountebanks was an existence of lepers in a leper house, and of the blessed in one of the Pleiades. There was every day a sudden transition from the noisy exhibition outside to the most complete seclusion. Every evening they made their exit from this world. They were like the dead, vanishing on condition of being reborn next day. A comedian is a revolving light, appearing one moment, disappearing the next, and existing for the public, but as a phantom or light, as his life circles round. To exhibition succeeded isolation. When the performance was finished, whilst the audience were dispensing, and their murmur of satisfaction was dying away in the streets, the green box shut up its platform, as a fortress does its drawbridge, and all communication with mankind was cut off. On one side, the universe, on the other, the caravan. And this caravan contained liberty, clear consciences, courage, devotion, innocence, happiness, love, all the constellations, blindness having sight, and deformity beloved, sat side by side, hand pressing hand, brow touching brow, and whispered to each other, intoxicated with love. The compartment in the middle served two purposes for the public. It was a stage for the actors, a dining room. Ursus, ever delighting in comparisons, profited by the diversity of its uses, to liken the central compartment in the green box to the aerodoc in an Abyssinian hut. Ursus counted the receipts, and they supped. In love, all is ideal. In love, eating and drinking together affords opportunities for many sweet, promiscuous touches, by which a mouthful becomes a kiss. They drink ale or wine from the same glass, as they might drink dew out of the same lily. Two souls in love are as full of grace as two birds. Gwynplaine waited on Dea, cut her bread, poured her drink, eyes as he turned away, his scolding melting into a smile. The wolf sulked under the table, heedless of everything which did not actually concern his bone. Phoebe and Venus shared the repast, but gave little trouble. These vagabonds, half wild and as uncouth as ever, spoke in their language to each other. At length, Dea re-entered the woman's apartment with Phoebe and Vinos. Ursus chained up Homo under the green box. Gwynplaine looked after the horses, the lover becoming a groom, like the hero of Homer's, or a paladin of Charlemagne's. At midnight, all were asleep, except the wolf, who, alive to his responsibility, now and then opened an eye. The next morning they met again. They breakfasted together, generally on ham and tea. Tea was introduced to England in 1678. Then Dea, after the Spanish fashion, took a siesta, acting on the advice of Ursus, who considered her delicate and slept for some hours, while Gwynplaine and Ursus did all the little jobs of work, without and within, which their wandering life made necessary. Gwynplaine rarely wandered away from the green box, except on unfrequented roads and solitary places. In cities, he went out only at night, disguised in a large slouched hat, so as not to exhibit his face in the street. His face was to be seen uncovered only on the stage. The green box had frequented cities but little. Gwynplaine, at 24, had never seen towns larger than the Cinque Ports. His renown, however, was increasing. It began to rise above the populace, and to percolate throughout the higher ground, amongst those who were fond of, and ran after the strange foreign curiosities and prodigies. It was known that there was somewhere in existence, leading a wandering life, now here, now there, an extraordinary monster. They talked about him, they sought him, they asked where he was. The laughing man was becoming decidedly famous. A certain luster was reflected on chaos vanquished. So much so that one day, Ursus, being ambitious, said, "We must go to London." Book the Third, The Beginning of the Fissure. Chapter 1, The Tadcaster Inn. At that period, London had but one bridge, London Bridge, with houses built upon it. This bridge united London to Southwark, a suburb which was paved with flint pebbles taken from the Thames, divided into small streets and alleys like the city, with a great number of buildings, houses, dwellings, wooden huts, jammed together, a pell-mell mixture of combustible matter, amidst which fire might take its pleasure. As 1666 had proved, Southwark was then pronounced sultry. It is now pronounced Southwark, or near it. Indeed, an excellent way of pronouncing English names is not to pronounce them. Thus, for Southampton to say Stumpton. There was a time when Chatham was pronounced Chatham. The Southwark of those days resembles the Southwark of today as much as a Vauxhall resembled Marseille. It was a village, it is a city. Nevertheless, a considerable trade was carried on there. The long old Cyclopean wall by the Thames was studded with rings, to which were anchored river barges. This wall was called the Evrock Wall, or the Evrock Stone. York, in Saxon times, was called Evrock. The legend related that a Duke of Evrock had been drowned at the foot of the wall. Certainly the water there was deep enough to drown a duke. At low water it was a good 6 fathoms. The excellence of this little anchorage attracted sea vessels, and the old Dutch tub called Volkrad came to anchor at the Evrock Stone. The Volkrad made the crossing from London to Rotterdam, and from Rotterdam to London, punctually once a week. Other barges started twice a day, either for Deptford, Greenwich, or Gravesend, going down with one tide and returning next. The voyage to Gravesend, though 20 miles, was performed in 6 hours. The Volgrot was of a model now no longer to be seen, except in naval museums. It was almost a junk. At that time, while France copied Greece, Holland copied China. The Volgrot, a heavy hull with 2 masts, was partitioned perpendicularly, so as to be watertight, having a narrow hold in the middle, and 2 decks, one fore and the other aft. The decks were flush with the iron turret vessels of the present day, the advantage of which is that in foul weather the force of the wave is diminished, and the inconvenience of which is that the crew is exposed to the action of the sea, owing that there are no bulwarks. There was nothing to save anyone on board from falling over, hence the frequent falls overboard and the losses of men which have caused the model to fall into disuse. The Volgrot went into Holland direct and did not even call at Gravesend. An old ridge of stones, rock as much as masonry, ran along the bottom of the Evrock stone. Being passable at all tides, was used as passage on board the ships moored to the wall. This wall was, at intervals, furnished with steps. It marked the southern point of Southwark. An embankment at the top allowed the passers-by to rest their elbows on the Evrock stone, as on the parapets at a quay. Thence they could look down upon the Thames. On the other side of the water, London dwindled away into fields. Up the river from the Evrock stone at the bend of the Thames, which is nearly opposite St. James's Palace, behind the Lambeth House, not far from the walk, then called Vauxhall probably, was there, between a pottery, in which they made porcelain, and glass blowers, where they made ornamental bottles, one of those large unenclosed spaces covered with grass, called formerly in France couchures and mails, and in England bowling greens. A bowling green, a green on which to roll a ball. The French have made their bowling green. Folks have this green inside their houses nowadays, only it is put on the table, is a cloth instead of turf, and it is called billiards. It is difficult to see why, having boulevard, which is the same word as bowling green in French, should have adopted bowling green. It is surprising that a person so grave as the dictionary should be indulged in the useless luxuries. The bowling green of Southwark was called Tarrinzeau Field, because it had belonged to the Barons Hastings, who also are the Barons Tarrinzeau and Mouchine. From the Lords Hastings, the Tarrinzeau Field passed to the Lords Tadcaster, who had made a speculation of it, just as at a later date a Duke of Orleans made a speculation of the Palais Royal. Tarrinzeau Field afterwards became a waste ground and a parochial property. Tarrinzeau Field was a kind of permanent fairground, covered with jugglers, athletes, mountebanks, and music on platforms, and always full of fools going to look at the devil. As Archbishop Sharp said, to look at the devil means to go to the play. Several inns which harbored the public and sent them to the outlandish exhibitions were established in this place, which kept holiday all year round, and thereby prospered. These inns were simply stalls, inhabited only during the day. In the evening, the tavern keeper put onto his pocket the key of the tavern and went away. Only one of those inns was a house, the only dwelling in the whole bowling green, the caravans of the fairground having the power of disappearing at any moment, considering the absence of any ties in the vagabond life of all mountebanks. Mountebanks have no roots to their lives. This inn is called the Tadcaster, after the former owners of the ground. It was an inn rather than a tavern, a hotel rather than an inn, so called, which was a large tap room, full of tobacco smoke, furnished with tables low in the ceiling. Over it was a window on the first floor, to the iron bars of which was fastened and hung the sign of the inn. The principal door was barred and bolted, and always remained closed. It was thus necessary to cross the tavern to enter the courtyard. At the Tadcaster Inn, there was a landlord and a boy. The landlord was called Master Nicholas, the boy Govicum. Master Nicholas, doubtless, which was the English habit of attraction and made Nicholas, was a miserly widower and one who was respected and feared the laws. As to his appearance, he had bushy eyebrows and hairy hands. The boy, aged 14, who poured out drink and answered to the main name of Govicum, wore a merry face and an apron. His hair was cropped close, a sign of servitude. He slept on the ground floor, in a nook in which they formerly kept a dog. This nook had for windows a bullseye looking on the bowling green. Chapter 2. Open Air Elegance. One very cold and windy evening, on which there was every reason why folks should hasten their way along the close under the walls of the tavern, stopped suddenly. It was during the last months of the winter between 1704 and 1705. This man, whose dress indicated a sailor, was of good mien and fine figure, things imperative to courtiers and not forbidden to common folk. Why then did he stop? To listen. What to? To a voice apparently speaking in the court on the other side of the wall, a voice a little weakened by age, but so powerful notwithstanding that it reached the passer-by in the street. At the same time, might be heard in an enclosure from which the voice came, the hubbub of a crowd. This voice said, "Men and women of London, here I am. I cordially wish you the joy of being English. You are a great people, I say no more. You are a great populace. Your fisticuffs are even better than your sword thrusts. You have an appetite. You are the nation which eats other nations, a magnificent function. This suction of the world makes England preeminent as politicians and philosophers in the management of colonies, populations, and industry, and in the desire to do others any harm which may turn to your own good. You stand alone. The hour will come when 2 boards will be put up on earth, inscribed on one side men, on the other Englishmen. I mention this to your glory, I who am neither English nor human, having the honor to be a bear. Still more, I am a doctor. That follows. Gentlemen, I teach what? 2 kinds of things. Things which I know, and things which I do not. I sell my drugs and I sell my ideas. Approach and listen. Science invites you. Open your ear if it is small. It will hold but little truth. If large, a great deal of folly will find its way in. Now then, attention. I teach the pseudodoxia epidemica. I have a comrade who will make you laugh, but I can make you think. We live in the same box, laughter being of quite as old a family as thought. When people asked Democritus, "How do you know?" he answered, "I laugh." And if I am asked, "Why do you laugh?" I shall answer, "I know." However, I am not laughing. I am the rectifier of popular errors. I take upon myself the task of cleaning your intellects. They require it. Heaven permits people to deceive themselves and to be deceived. It is useless to be absurdly modest. I frankly avow that I believe in providence, even where it is wrong. Only when I see filth, errors are filth, I sweep them away. How am I sure of what I know? That concerns only myself. Everyone catches wisdom as he can. Lactantius asked questions of and received answers from a bronze head of Virgil. Sylvester II conversed with birds. Did the birds speak? Did the Pope twitter? That is a question. The dead child of the Rabbi Alcazar talked to St. Augustine. Between ourselves, I doubt all these facts except the last. The dead child might perhaps talk, because under its tongue it had a gold plate, on which were engraved divers constellations. Then, thus, he deceived people. The fact explains itself. You see my moderation. I separate the true from the false. See, here are other errors in which no doubt you partake, poor ignorant folks that you are, and from which I wish to free you. Dioscorides believed that there was a god in the henbane, Chrysippus in the cynopaste, Josephus in the root Paris, Homer in the plant moly. They were all wrong. The spirits and herbs are not gods but devils. I have tested this fact. It is not true that the serpent which tested Eve had a human face, as Cadmus relates. Garcias de Hoto, Canamosto, and John Hugo, Archbishop of Treves, deny that it is sufficient to saw down a tree to catch an elephant. I incline to their opinion. Citizens, the efforts of Lucifer are the cause of all false impressions. Under the reign of such a prince, it is natural that meteors of error and perdition should arise. My friends, Claudius Pulcher did not die because of the fowls, refused to come out of the fowl house. The fact is that Lucifer, having foreseen the death of Claudius Pulcher, took care to prevent the birds feeding. That Beelzebub gave the emperor Vespasian the virtue of curing the lame, and giving the sight to the blind by his touch was an act praiseworthy in itself, but of which the motive was culpable. Gentlemen, distrust those false doctors who sell the root of the bryony and the blood of a cock. See clearly that which is false. It is not quite true that Orion was the result of a natural function of Jupiter. The truth is that it was Mercury who produced this star in that way. It is not true that Adam had a navel. When St. George killed the dragon, he had not the daughter of a saint standing by his side. St. Jerome had not a clock in the chimney piece in his study. First, because living in a cave, he had no study. Secondly, because he had no chimney piece. Thirdly, because clocks were not yet invented. Let us put these things right. Put them right, O gentle folks who listen to me. If anyone tells you that a lizard will be born in your head if you smell the herb valerian, that the rotting carcass of the ox changes into bees, and that of the horse into hornets, that a man weighs more than a dead one alive, that the blood of the he-goat dissolves into emeralds, that a caterpillar, a fly, and a spider seen on the same tree announces famine, war, and pestilence, that the falling sickness is to be cured by a worm found in the head of a buck. Do not believe him. These things are errors. But now listen to truths. The skin of a sea calf is a safeguard against thunder. The toad feeds upon earth, which causes a stone to come into his head. The rose of Jericho blooms on Christmas Eve. Serpents cannot endure the shadow of an ash tree. The elephant has no joints and sleeps resting upright against a tree. Make a toad sit upon a cock's egg, and he will hatch a scorpion, which will become a salamander. A blind person will recover sight by putting one hand on the left side of an altar, and the other on his eyes. Virginity does not hinder maternity. Honest people lay these truths to heart. Above all, you can believe in providence in either of the two ways, either as thirst believes in the orange, or as the ass believes in the whip. Now I am going to introduce you to my family. Here, a violent gust of wind shook the window frames and shutters of the inn, which stood detached. It was like a prolonged murmur of the sky. The orator paused for a moment, and then resumed. An interruption. Very good. Speak, north wind. Gentlemen, I am not angry. The wind is loquacious, like all solitary creatures. There is no one to keep him company up there, so he jabbers. I resume the thread of my discourse. Here you see associated artists. We are four. A lupo principium. I begin by my friend, who is a wolf. He does not conceal it. See him. He is educated, grave, and sagacious. Providence, perhaps, entertained for a moment by the idea of making him a doctor of the university. But for that, as he does howl. He howls in sympathy with man. He barks as well, in condescension to civilization. A magnanimous concession. Homo is a dog made perfect. Let us venerate the dog. The dog, curious animal, sweats with its tongue and smiles with its tail. Gentlemen, Homo equals in wisdom and surpasses in cordiality the hairless wolf of Mexico, the wonderful Zolizensky. I may add that he is humble. He has the modesty of a wolf, who is useful to men. He is helpful and charitable, and says nothing about it. His left paw knows not the good which his right paw does. These are his merits. Of the other, my second friend, I have but one word to say. He is a monster. You will admire him. He was formerly abandoned by pirates on the shores of the wild ocean. This third one is blind. Is she an exception? No, we are all blind. The miser is blind. He sees the gold, but he does not see the riches. The prodigal is blind. He sees the beginning and does not see the end. The coquette is blind. She does not see her wrinkles. The learned man is blind. He does not see his own ignorance. The honest man is blind. He does not see the thief. The thief is blind. He does not see God. God is blind. The day he created the world, he did not see the devil. The day he created it, I myself am blind. I speak, and I do not see that you are deaf. The blind girl who accompanies us is a mysterious priestess. Vesta has confided to her torch. She has in her character depths as soft as a division in the wool of a sheep. I believe her to be a king's daughter, though I do not assert it as a fact. A laudable distrust is an attribute of wisdom. For my own part, I reason, and I doctor. I think, and I heal. Chirurgus some, I cure fevers, miasmas, and plagues. Almost all our melancholy and sufferings are issues, which if carefully treated relieve us quietly from the other evils, which might be worse. All the same, I do not recommend you to have an anthrax, otherwise called a carbuncle. It is a stupid malady, and serves no good end. One dies of it, that is all. I am neither uncultivated nor rustic. I honor eloquence and poetry, and live in an innocent union with these goddesses. I conclude by a piece of advice. Ladies and gentlemen, on the sunny side of your dispositions, cultivate virtue, modesty, honesty, probity, justice, and love. Each one here below may thus have his little bud of flowers on his window-sill. My lords and gentlemen, I have spoken. The play is about to begin. The man, who was apparently a sailor, and who had been listening outside, entered the lower room of the inn, crossed it, paid the necessary entrance money, reached the courtyard, which was full of people, saw at the bottom of it a caravan on wheels, wide open, and on the platform an old man dressed in a bearskin, a young man looking like a mask, a blind girl, and a wolf. Gracious heaven, he cried, what delightful people! Chapter 3, where the passer-by reappears. The green box, as we have just seen, had arrived in London. It was established at Southwark. Ursus had been tempted by the bowling green, which had one great recommendation, that it was always fair day there, even in winter. The dome of St. Paul's was a delight to Ursus. London, take it all in all, has some good in it. It was a brave thing to do, to dedicate a cathedral to St. Paul. The real cathedral saint is St. Peter. St. Paul is suspected of imagination, and in matters ecclesiastical, imagination means heresy. St. Paul is a saint only with the extenuating circumstances. He entered heaven only by the artist's door. A cathedral is a sign. St. Peter is the sign of Rome, the city of the dogma. St. Paul, that of London, the city of the schism. Ursus, whose philosophy had arms so long that it embraced everything, was a man who appreciated these shades of difference, and his attraction towards London arose, perhaps, from a certain taste for St. Paul. The yard of the Tadcaster Inn had taken the fancy of Ursus. It might have been ordered for the Green Box. It was a theatre ready-made. It was a square with 3 sides built round, and a wall forming the fourth. Against this wall was placed the green box, which they were able to draw into the yard, owing to the height of the gate. A large wooden balcony roofed over and supported on posts, on which the rooms of the first story opened, ran round the three fronts of the interior facade of the house, making two right angles. The windows to the ground floor made boxes, the pavement of the court to the pit, and the balcony of the gallery. The green box reared against the wall was thus in front of a theatre. It was very like the Globe, where they played Othello, King Lear, and the Tempest. In a corner behind the green box was a stable. Ursus had made arrangements with a tavern keeper, Master Nicholas, who, owing to his respect for the law, would not admit the wolf without charging him extra. The placard, Gwynplaine the Laughing Man, was taken from its nail in the green box. It was hung up close to the sign of the inn. The sitting room of the tavern had, as we have seen, an inside door which opened into the court. By the side of the door was constructed offhand, by means of an empty barrel, a box of money-taker, who was sometimes Phoebe and sometimes Phinos. It was managed much as at present. Pay and pass in, under the placard, announcing the Laughing Man, was a piece of wood, painted white, hung on two nails, which was written in charcoal in large letters, the title of Ursus' grand piece, Chaos Vanquished. In the center of the balcony, precisely opposite the green box, and in a compartment having for entrance a window reaching to the ground, there had been partitioned off a space for the nobility. It was large enough to hold in 2 rows 10 spectators. "We are in London," said Ursus. "We must be prepared for the gentry." He had furnished the box with the best chairs in the inn, and had placed in the center a grand armchair of yellow, Utrecht velvet, with a cherry-colored pattern, in case some alderman's wife should come. They began their performances. The crowd immediately flocked to them, but the compartment for the nobility remained empty. With that exception, their success became so great that no mountebank memory could recall its parallel. All Southwark ran in crowds to admire the Laughing Man. The Merry Andrews and the mountebanks at the Tarrinzeau field were aghast at Gwynplaine. The effect he caused was as that of a sparrow-hawk flapping his wings in the cage of goldfinches and feeding in their seed trough. Gwynplaine ate up their public. Besides the small fry, the swallowers of swords and the grimace-makers, real performances took place on the screen. There was a circus of women, ringing from morning till night, with a magnificent peal of all sorts of instruments, psalteries, drums, rebecks, megamons, timbrels, reeds, dulcimers, gongs, chevrets, bagpipes, German horns, English escudilles, pipes, flutes, and flageolets. In a large round tent were some tumblers, who could not have equalled our present climbers of the Pyrenees, Dolma, Bordenave, Maylonga, who, from the peak of the Pierrefitte, descend to the plateau of the Limousin, almost perpendicular height. There was a traveling menagerie, where was to be seen a performing tiger, who, lashed by the keepers, snapped at the whip, and tried to swallow the lash. Even this comedian of jaws and claws was eclipsed in success. Curiosity, applause, receipts, crowds, the Laughing Man monopolized everything. It happened in the twinkling of an eye. Nothing was thought of but the green box. Chaos vanquished is chaos victor, said Ursus, appropriating half Gwynplaine's success, taking the wind out of his sails, as they say at sea. That success was prodigious. Still, it remained local. Fame does not cross the sea easily. It took 130 years for the name of Shakespeare to penetrate from England to France. The sea is a wall, and if Voltaire, a thing which he very much regretted when it was too late, had not thrown a bridge over to Shakespeare, Shakespeare might still be in England on the other side of the wall, a captive in insular glory. The glory of Gwynplaine had not passed London Bridge. It was not great enough yet to re-echo throughout the city, at least not at first, but Southwark ought to have sufficed to satisfy the ambition of a clown. Ursus said, "The money bag grows palpably bigger." played Ursus Rosus and Chaos Vanquished. Between the acts, Ursus exhibited his power as an encastrumist and executed marvels of ventriloquism. He imitated every cry which occurred in the audience, a song, a cry, enough to startle, so exact the imitation, the singer or the crier himself. Now and then he copied the hubbub of the public, and whistled as if there was a crowd of people within him. These were remarkable talents. Besides this, he harangued like Cicero, as we have seen, sold his drugs, attended sickness, and even healed the sick. Southark was enthralled. Ursus was satisfied with the applause of Southark, but by no means astonished. "They are the ancient Trinovantes," he said. Then he added, "I must not mistake them for delicacy of taste. For the Atropons, who peopled Berkshire, or the Belgians, who inhabited Somersetshire, nor for the Parisians, who founded York. At every performance, the yard of the inn, transformed into a pit, was filled with a ragged and enthusiastic audience. It was composed of watermen, chairmen, coachmen, and bargemen, and sailors just ashore, spending their wages in feasting and women. In it there were felons, ruffians, and blackguards, who were soldiers condemned for some crime against discipline to wear their red coats, which were lined with black inside out, and thence the name of blackguard, which in French they turn into blackguards. All these flowed from the street into the theatre and poured black from the theatre into the tap. Emptying of tankards did not decrease their success. Amidst what is usual to call the scum, there was one taller than the rest, bigger, stronger, less poverty-stricken, broader in the shoulders, dressed like the common people, but not ragged, admiring and applauding everything into the skies, clearing his way with his fists, wearing a disordered periwig, swearing, shouting, joking, never dirty, and at need, ready to black an eye, or pay for a bottle. This frequenter was the passer-by, whose cheer of enthusiasm has been recorded. This connoisseur was suddenly fascinated, and had adopted the laughing man. He did not come every evening, but when he came he led the public. Applause grew into acclamation. Success rose not to the roof, for there was none, but to the clouds, for there were plenty of them. Which clouds, seeing that there was no roof, sometimes wept over the masterpiece of Ursus. His enthusiasm caused Ursus to remark this man, and Gwynplaine to observe him. They had a great friend in this unknown visitor. Ursus and Gwynplaine wanted to know him, at least to know who he was. One evening, Ursus was in the side scene, which was the kitchen door of the Green Box. Seeing Master Nicholas standing by him, showed him this man in the crowd, and asked him, "Do you know that man?" "Of course I do." "Who is he?" "A sailor." "What is his name?" said Gwynplaine, interrupting. "Tom Jim Jack," replied the innkeeper. Then, as he redescended the steps at the back of the Green Box to enter the inn, Master Nicholas let fall this profound reflection so deep as to be unintelligible. What a pity that he should not be a lord. He would make a famous scoundrel. Otherwise, although established in the tavern, the group in the Green Box had in no way altered their manner of living, and held to their isolated habits. Except a few words exchanged now and then with the tavern keeper, they held no communication with any of those who were living, either permanently or temporarily in the inn, and continued to keep to themselves. Since they had been at Southark, Gwynplaine had made it his habit after the performance and the supper of both the family and horses, when Ursus and Dea had gone to bed in their respective compartments, to breathe a little fresh air at the bowling greens between 11 o'clock and midnight. A certain vagrancy in our spirits impels us to take walks at night and to saunter under the stars. There is mysterious expectation in youth. Therefore, it is that we are prone to wander out in the night without an object. At that hour, there was no one in the fairground, except perhaps some reeling drunkard, making staggering shadows in dark corners. The empty taverns were shut up, and the lower rooms in the Tadcaster Inn was dark, except where, in some corner, a solitary candle lighted a last reveler. An indistinct glow gleamed through the window shutters of the half-closed tavern, as Gwynplaine, pensive, content, and dreaming, happy in a haze of divine joy, passed backwards and forwards in front of the half-open door. Of what was he thinking? Of Dea, of nothing, of everything, of the depths. He never wandered far from the green box, being held as if by a thread to Dea. A few steps away from it was far enough for him. Then he returned, found the whole green box asleep, and went to bed himself. And that is the end of this part of the reading of The Man Who Laughs by Victor Hugo. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and as always, I wish you